Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 227, Woolen, Wales. Wales, as I am sure you're aware, from episodes going very far back, relied on a fluffy animal for much of its agricultural success for at least 2,000 years. From clothing to food, sheep featured as a key ingredient to Welsh success. While we talk about this as a Welsh subject, it's plainly obvious that sheep were all across the British Islands and much of the rest of the world. But somehow, Wales lived with them in a way, both positively and negatively, if we're all honest with ourselves, for many years, and are still to this day defined by their relationship with this little fluffy head. Because of their coat of wool, sheep are able to deal with fairly cool, inclement weather that is a feature for much of Wales. Sheep have been domesticated for thousands of years and providing humans with wool, which of course is then made into cloth, which acts as a protection for our ancestors from the weather in colder and wetter Northern European climates especially. In the UK, where woolen clothing would later flourish, sheep farming took root as early as the Roman occupation, or at least the records of it. By the Middle Ages, wool became England's most important commodity, even surpassing the value of agricultural crops. Sheep were key to everyday life, and they offered an advantage that made a lot of people very, very wealthy over those 2,000 years. Another part of their advantage was that they could feed on most grasses that were available, and were able to live in climates and at elevations that wouldn't normally be a place where you would keep most animals. This is something that's an advantage when you live in a more hilly and some would say mountainous climate, where conditions can be a lot more difficult. And also it's a more difficult place to live as far as, if you think about it, a horse or a cow living in an elevation where there's a lot of up and down is going to have problems with that. And it's very easy for them to hurt themselves. Sheep, the way they have evolved, have learned to live in those kind of climates much easier and in those kind of elevations in a way that makes them able to cope with a lot of things that other animals may or may not be able to. All of this, of course, means that they were relatively easy to raise and care for and key to many shepherds from the Levant in the Middle East to the coastlines of North Wales. It also helps that generally they could be easily led in groups and were, of course, very docile compared to other animals that were sought for domestication. Now, when I say that sheep were in heavy use since the Roman period, they were not unknown to Wales before that. In fact, there's loads of evidence to the opposite of that. Quote, historian Alan Marshall in his book Sheeplands, How Sheep Shaped Wales and the World. In 1972, an archaeological dig beside a cairn unearthed a Stone Age bone. The bone was carved into a musical instrument, 5,700-year-old flute. The flute tells us that the people of Stone Age Wales were both musical and craftspeople. But also importantly, the flute also indicates that there were sheep farmers too, for this instrument was made from the bone of a sheep, end quote. It is thought that the sheep arrived in the UK around 4000 BCE, during a period of slow migration, as in the midst of the Stone Age, people continued to migrate to at least some degree. And although there are unknowns as to how and why, and we don't know how many sheep migrated, we don't know how frequently they migrated, and we don't even understand fully what the reason was for them to migrate. It is thought, however, that they entered Wales via Ireland, and then before that came from the French coast, showing that there was this constant pattern of migration from Anatolia all the way across Europe to Britain. It was, of course, a very long process, and certainly not one where you could measure things out in short patterns. It took ages for things to happen in the Stone Age, something we brought up in the Ancient Wales podcast. And so you didn't have instant technology transmission or instant animals spreading across various locations. So especially with a domesticated animal, it would take time and effort. With these sheep came humans, of course, and DNA evidence seems to show that people from an area around Brittany share DNA with the Welsh population, and some people think that this stems from the Stone Age period. It is difficult to know for sure, whether this is likely simply because there was an exodus from this same area of Britain to Brittany in the Middle Ages. So do we understand or know fully that that isn't the reason why there's this exchange of DNA? That I am not an expert on and couldn't really speak to, but that's, again, the interpretation of some is that there was DNA that traveled across, or in other words, people that traveled across from Brittany to Ireland and then to Wales. In other words, the Welsh and sheep have been partners for a very long time. Now let's talk about sheep farming. Farming for wool isn't just about raising animals for their fleece. The process starts with selective breeding of sheep, which helps produce finer and softer wool. In regions such as Wales, where the climate was well suited for sheep farming, the native breeds, like the Welsh mountain sheep, thrived. These hardy animals adapted to the rugged terrain and colder climate, producing thick, coarse wool that was perfect for making durable fabrics. Shearing typically takes place in late spring and early summer, once the risk of frost had passed. Each sheep could produce several pounds of wool per year, and it was the job of skilled shearers to remove the fleece in one piece, ensuring minimal damage to the wool fibers. This fleece would then undergo a series of lengthy processes of cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving, all done by hand before the advent of machinery. It was an incredibly labor-intensive process, but the results were a fabric that was highly prized for its warmth, durability, and versatility. Now, the success of the woolen industry wasn't just down to farming. The geographic distribution of sheep played a significant role. In England, for example, regions such as the Cotswolds, Yorkshire, and the Lake District became renowned for their wool production, each developing their own distinct styles and techniques. Meanwhile, in Wales, its rugged landscape produced heavier wool that would eventually be used in flannel production, a fabric that has since become synonymous with Welsh craftsmanship. But before we move on to Welsh flannel, let's talk about how sheep farming gave birth to an entire economy. In medieval times, wool wasn't just a commodity. It was also the backbone of the British economy. The Welsh generated by the wool trade fueled the growth of towns, the construction of cathedrals, and even the power of the monarchy. Kings imposed taxes on wool exports, and entire regions became dependent on sheep farming. Wool merchants became some of the richest individuals in Europe, financing voyages, wars, and estates. However, as Europe became more industrialized, woolen cloth industry was about to experience a revolution of its own. We've talked a lot about this over the years, in piecemeal, in part, in episode here, episode there, but we've talked about how the changes to this industry led to so much that we consider part of the modern world. The Industrial Revolution, in part, comes out of this. There is a method of trying to create spinning equipment that will become important. We'll talk a little bit more in detail here. But the reality of it is that the sheep, this humble little animal, happens to become incredibly important to Britain, so much so that the benefits of it have far-reaching aspects and are part of the reason, amongst many, that there is conquest and reasons why other nations would want this industry, especially in periods before the Industrial Age. So now we enter this Industrial Revolution. By the late 18th century, advances in technology were beginning to change the way woolen cloth was produced. Machines like spinning jennies and the power loom and steam engines transformed a once labor-intensive industry into a mechanized powerhouse. Before this period, wool production was largely a cottage industry, quite literally. Families would work from their homes, spinning wool and yarn, weaving cloth on these small looms. But as machines were developed to speed up production, woolen mills began to spring up in towns and cities, particularly in Yorkshire and Lancashire. These mills housed rows of mechanized looms and spinners capable of producing cloth at unprecedented speeds and volumes. The shift from hand production to industrial manufacturing brought about a seismic change in the woolen industry. Wool could now be produced in far greater quantities and at a fraction of the cost. This allowed manufacturers to meet the growing demand for woolen fabric, both home and abroad, especially if you're a empire like Britain, where there are a massive amount of colonies dependent upon various parts of your industries to produce and grow various things that assist these colonies to function. Keep in mind that the role of a colony is to produce specific types of things and send them back to the mother country, who then produces them into the items that of everyday use, which are then sent back. So you have this kind of flow of items and export, which are coming in and out. And so all of these various colonies have become dependent on these various items. So wool, like everything else, is now a dependency. Even if they have their own wool and their own sheep, they may not have the ability to manufacture, certainly at the numbers that industries would have in England and in places like Scotland and Wales. And all of this means that it would drive it back to the rest of the empire after it's been produced. So yes, they would collect it from Wales. Yes, they would collect it from other parts of the UK. But conversely, they would also see wool coming from other locations, much like you would see cotton coming from the United States and other places being shipped in mass quantities into these places and then developed into clothing, which would then be resold and in some cases sold back to these same colonies. All of this was kind of the function of colonies. They would help to create a stronger center by making the center much more capable of sending stuff in and out and earn money on both transactions effectively, which is why when you're a colony, your situation is never as good as the mother country, because the mother country benefits from you more than you do from it. Something to keep in mind as we go farther into the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Of course, this industrial boom wasn't without its downsides. The rise of factories meant the decline of the cottage industries, and many rural families who had relied on hand weaving for their livelihoods found themselves suddenly displaced. Urbanization would follow as workers flocked to these various industrial centers in search of employment, and the conditions in these early factories were often harsh, with long hours, poor ventilation, and dangerous machinery. And living in a compressed and dense city would have its own problems in an era when medicine and vaccinations weren't really a thing as they would be later. So illnesses and sicknesses would run ravage through industrial centers. Despite these challenges, the Industrial Revolution did propel the woolen industry into a new era. With greater efficiency came the ability to experiment with new materials and methods, leading to the innovation in fabric production, none more significant than the rise of Welsh flannel. Welsh flannel is a fabric that holds special place in the history of the woolen cloth industry. Flannel, which refers to a soft, warm fabric made from carded wool, became a hallmark of the Welsh textile production in the 19th century. The heavy, durable wool produced by the Welsh mountain sheep was ideal for making flannel, and the fabric quickly gained a reputation for its quality and durability. The key to the Welsh flannel's success lay in its unique manufacturing process. While the rest of Britain was moving towards a lighter and finer wools, Welsh weavers stuck to their traditional methods of fulling, a process where woolen fabric was repeatedly soaked and pounded to increase its density and strength. This made Welsh flannel particularly suited for cold and damp climates, which meant it was not only popular in the UK, but also exported to countries with similar harsh conditions. Canada might be one of those. One of the most iconic centers for flannel production was Newton in mid-Wales. By the mid-19th century, this small town had become the beating heart of the Welsh woolen industry. The flannel produced here wasn't just used for clothing, it was also used to make blankets, bedding, and other household textiles. The Newton flannel industry was so successful that it attracted attention from around the world. But as demand for Welsh flannel grew, so did the needs to get it to consumers. And this is where the story of the woolen cloth industry takes a fascinating turn, towards the rise of mail-order companies. In the mid-19th century, a visionary entrepreneur by the name of Price Jones revolutionized the way woolen cloth was sold. Now, I should clarify that Price was his first name, and then Price-Jones was his last name. Born in Newtown, Wales in 1834, Price Jones started his career as an apprentice to a draper before setting up his own business selling flannel. But it wasn't enough for him to sell flannel in his local shop. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted to reach customers far beyond the borders of Wales. And so in 1861, Price Jones did something relatively groundbreaking. He started the world's first mail-order business. At a time when most people bought goods directly from shops, Price Jones had the radical idea of sending out catalogs to potential customers, allowing them to order flannel by post. Customers would write in their orders, and the goods would be sent directly to their homes via an expanding postal network. Now, in a day of Amazon and all the other online ordering systems we have, this would seem very normal. But at this point, this was something of a earthquake of change for the way goods were made, shipped, and given to customers. Price Jones' innovation changed the way people shopped, not just in Wales, but across the globe. His mail-order business took off, and soon he was shipping Welsh flannel to customers as far away as Australia, the United States, and Russia. He even counted Queen Victoria and the Empress of Austria among his clients. What made Price Jones' mail-order business so successful, you might ask? Well, part of it was his ability to tap into the growing trend for convenience, something that was starting to happen in the 19th century. There is a situation that comes out of the 19th century, particularly in the later 19th century, which changes the way we do business and the way we shop. I think I've mentioned this before, but if I haven't, let me clarify what I mean by that. In the era before this, largely most shopping, most market days were done by men. Men would sell the goods, and largely men would buy the goods. You would not have a female-led shopping trip as we would think of in the classical idea of what shopping was for many, many generations. This was actually, in a way, something that only came about in the Victorian period in some massive measure, as it became seen to be better for women to do this role or this job, something which we nowadays kind of look at as being a view as a negative. At that point, it was seen as a net positive. And because of this, changing ideas and changing concepts of how things were done, this also meant that there was a charge towards things that we would see as more modern, like vacations or having a second home that you might visit at certain times of the year, or in this particular case, in having the convenience of having things shipped from across various locations and having access to them on a continual basis, something that wouldn't have really have been possible before this. Convenience, or in other words, the ability to have these things, makes a massive difference. And because of the way there was an expansion in the railway, a big key, along with this setup of a postal service that would be creating post offices across Britain, this meant that goods could be transported quickly and efficiently along very long distances. Price Jones saw an opportunity to use this new network to his advantage, offering customers the chance to buy high-quality products without having to leave their homes. Again, sounds familiar. His catalogs didn't just contain flannel either. Price Jones expanded his offerings to include all manner of woolen products, from blankets to undergarments to outerwear. The convenience and quality of his products made Price Jones a household name, and by the time of his death in 1920, his business had become a global success. The impact of the mail-order companies like Price Jones Limited cannot be overstated. They paved the way for direct-to-consumer retail models that we see today, as I said, in companies like Amazon and eBay. The ability to shop from home was a novelty in the 19th century, but it has since become the norm, especially since the pandemic. It is not uncommon to do all of your shopping that way. As we reflect on the history of the woolen cloth industry, it's clear that the legacy is vast and enduring, especially in places like Wales. From the sheep that roamed the hills of Wales and England to the factories that churned out miles of fabric during the Industrial Revolution, wool has been the center of human society for centuries. The developments of woolen flannel and the pioneering spirit of entrepreneurs like Price Jones remind us that industries are shaped not just from the products they produce, but by the people who innovate and adapt and lead them into these new eras. Today, many woolen cloth industries may be smaller in scale, but they continue to thrive, and with traditional techniques and modern technology working together to keep this ancient craft alive. So next time you pull a cozy wool sweater and wrap yourself up in a warm blanket, remember that journey that fabric has taken from the back of a sheep through the hands of skilled craftsmen, perhaps even through the mail from some small town in Wales. And with that, I'd like to thank you for watching or listening today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me via Twitter/X, depending on your flavor of choice, at Welsh History Pod, or you can join us on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you'd like to help fund this particular podcast and then the research I do, you can do such at patreon.com/Welsh History. And I'd like to thank everybody for everything they do for me. And thank you so much for today. I hope you got something out of this. I hope there was introducing to you some things that are a bit new and a bit different. And we will, as I'm sure you can imagine, go back and talk more about sheep, wool, and all the derivatives that have effect on Wales, especially in our Ancient Wales series. We'll definitely be going back to it because it has relationships even back then that we need to discuss, and they're important to us. And as well, just as a slight aside before we end today, I just kind of wanted to mention that the book that I pulled from, which Sheeplands, How Sheep Shaped Wales and the World, that particular book is quite good in giving you an overview of not only the effect of sheep and how they got to Wales, but it also talks about its effect in regions across the world and how from Mongolia all the way to North America, sheep have been very critical to the way the world works and the way the world functions. Places like New Zealand, for example, much like Wales, are well known for sheep and for wool production. So it's become such a major part of our overall world that it's hard to understand just how far and how long we've really had them with us. Some estimations I've seen, it's like 8,000 years of domestication, which is an incredible long time to have this animal be with us as we go through our daily lives effectively. Now, most of us these days don't wear a lot of wool. I know some who do. I have some things that are wool and some things that have flannel, such as blankets and things, but it's not as common as it once was, but still, it still remains a part of our society, and it's still an important part of our society. So anyway, with all that said and done, thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.